Erev Tov, everyone. Shavua Tov, Chodesh Tov. It's a 2-day Rosh Chodesh, so we'll still be saying Alev Yavor when we get to Maariv. Okay, I wanted to talk tonight about a case that came up recently, a very fascinating question in Halakha. It's also a very tragic case, a tragic human error that occurred. Sometimes we talk about halakhic questions, we can discuss them intellectually, and they're very, very interesting. You analyze the different sides. When these are real-world cases that happen to real people, there's a certain tragedy and there's a certain sensitivity that needs to be borne in mind, of course, when we discuss as well. So, we talk about these things very analytically, but there's that sensitivity that needs to be brought to bear. What am I talking about? So there's a case which was in the news a couple of years ago, and it recently made the headlines again. So in September of 2022, there was came to the headlines. One of the hospitals had done a fertility procedure that had been done, IVF, in vitro fertilization, and there was a couple that was, when they reached 30 weeks pregnancy, so they discovered, I don't know how they discovered or what caused them to check, but they realized they'd implanted the wrong embryo. So they'd taken an embryo that had been fertilized from one couple and placed it into the womb of another woman. So the baby that she was carrying was not their baby. Right? This happens. Mistakes happen from time to time. Maybe the number one lesson to learn from this is that when these procedures are done, that one should have the proper pikuach and the proper hashgacha. There's a halachic standard of hashgacha that is required, which is higher than the medical standard, because these mistakes can happen. No. So the other lady wasn't. So the problem, the case was, they didn't actually know. It got more complicated because they didn't know who the parents were. Meaning they realized you can do a simple blood test and there's easy ways to determine, but they determined this was not, or maybe they realized they found. I don't know exactly how they determined it, but this couple was carrying the embryo that was from somebody else. And the hospital immediately wanted to find out who was actually the genetic parents, right? We'll talk in a moment, and the question is halachically, who is the mother? Right? Is it the mother who's genetic material or the mother who gives birth? That's not so clear. But but everybody wanted to know who it was. And that's why when you have cases, again, different, depending on what the fertility challenges are, sometimes a simple procedure, a couple will go to a procedure of IVF, where it is the sperm of the husband and it's the egg of the wife, and that is the baby. But sometimes they're not able to do that for whatever reason. So you have surrogacy, where it's done with the intention, right, that the fertilized embryo from one mother or from one couple is placed for somebody else. That raises its own halachic challenges, but that can be done. But here it was not done intentionally. Here it was done accidentally, inadvertently, recklessly, however Shogeg made it, however you want to describe it. So the hospital immediately wanted to find out who the real parents were. They started doing genetic tests, started testing with some other parents. They couldn't locate the couple who were the parents. While they were checking, so this woman gave birth, and the baby was born, and the couple who had the baby wanted to keep the baby. They went to Mishran Apanim, they registered, that the baby was given birth, that this was their baby. They were the parents. They were able to do that. In any event, nobody knew who the parents were. So then the question was, should they keep looking to find out who the parents were? The couple who had given birth, obviously, were not interested in that. The hospital wanted to know. The case went to court. It went to the district court. It went to the Supreme Court. And at different times, the court said, keep looking. The court said, don't keep looking. The parents appealed, said, don't keep looking, etc. It went back and forth for a couple of years. The baby's now 2 years old. And it just came out that actually 6 months ago, but it was only just now, a couple of weeks ago, released for publication, that they found out who the actual parents were, meaning the genetically biological parents based on the genetic material. So now you have a situation where this baby has been born, 2 years old, being raised by her parents. There is another set of parents somewhere who went and did their treatment in the hospital, and their embryo was placed inside this other couple who gave birth. And they say, well, it's our baby. We want the baby back. So they went to court. The court just ruled that, in fact, the parents who are raising the child have to give up the baby to the other parents. And the last I read is that they're now appealing to the High Court. And so we haven't heard the end of the story. I'm sure it will probably go back and forth. And that is the situation. As I said at the beginning, we can talk about it. It's a tragic story. It was a tragic error that happened, and a chain of, and that's the result. That's where it is today. So this raises many questions, many ethical questions, many legal questions, many halachic questions. Right? Whatever the court rules, we can ask the question halachically: what should you do? Who should, what is the court is looking at it from one perspective of tovat hayeled, which is what is for the ultimate good of the child. So the judge ruled that it would be for the good of the child to go back to the original parents, quote unquote, that would overcome the damage that would be done by taking her away. I haven't read the full psak, but that was the summary. Like I say, it will go to the High Court. I wouldn't be surprised if the High Court overturns the ruling and then they appeal again. But that's where it is. But what I want to talk about, so like I said, many different angles to this and many halachic challenges. But let's ask the question, halachically speaking, wherever the child ends up and whichever group set of parents raise the child, who is the mother? Who is actually considered? Because what you have here, you have a situation whereby one mother whose egg, whose genetic material formed this baby, that's what we call probably the biological mother, but a different mother who gave birth. So who is actually considered halachically the mother? When the case happened, so the chief rabbi at the time, he's no longer the chief rabbi because his term has ended, but Rav David Lau was the chief rabbi of Israel at the time, Ashkenazi. He wrote a letter, he wrote a psak, saying, it was a very strange letter. He wrote a letter saying that the mother who was giving birth, I'm not sure if it was before birth or after birth, but he said the mother who was giving birth to the child, she is considered halachically the mother. Right? There's no chokhmah there because nobody knew who the biological mother was. So obviously we relate to it as there is certainly an opinion in the poskim that she's the mother, and therefore we treat her as the mother, and that's it. But now, so why do I mention all of this? Because there's a very interesting precedent, and in fact, it can be used as a proof for both sides of the argument, which comes from our parasha, right? And that is the following, and the poskim relate to this. It says like this. So where we have in Parashat Vayetze the birth of all the tribes, of all the shvatim. Now you'll notice something very interesting. The psukim that describe the birth of each one of the shvatim, we find a word. It always says Vatahal Vateled. Right, and she fell pregnant, and she conceived, and gave birth. Right, it says, so for example, Vatar Leah Vateled Ben Vatikra Shmo Reuven, Vatar Od Vateled Ben Shimon, Vatar Od Vateled Ben Levi, right? Vatar Od Vateled Ben Yehuda. There is one exception to that. Later on, it says Vachal Yarda Bat Vatikra Shma Dina. When Dina is born, the daughter, it does not say the word Vataha. It just says Vateled. It just says that she gave birth, not that she conceived, but she gave birth. So how is it possible to give birth without conceiving? So says Pirush HaTur, and again, I love discussing this because whether we get whatever halachic conclusion we get to at the end of the day, and whether we'll come to the conclusion that this can be a halachic precedent, or what many poskim say, at the end of the day, you're dealing with agarata. You can't use agarata as a precedent to paskin halacha. But what we do find is that there's a conception, and there is something with, no pun intended, right? That there's a concept here, which again for thousands of years must have seemed like absolute nonsense. It seems like absolute science fiction, and you would look at this and you would learn this and say, what on earth is the Midrash trying to teach us? What are Chazal telling us? Something which could not be. But in fact, we see principles that come out, and we see a case which actually modern technology says this is something which could be which could take place exactly. So the case is this. The Tur explains the following. He says, quotes the Midrash now, which is brought in the Targum Yonatan as well. Says the following. He says, says that the conception of the child was not Leah was the woman who gave birth, but actually was first by Rachel, not by Leah. How so? Meaning, Rachel was meant to give birth to a daughter. Ella and Leah saw this through prophecy, through Ruach HaKodesh, she understood. Ella shitpalela alea שלא יהיה חלקה בבנים פחות מאחת השפחות ותחלפנה מבטן רחל ללאה. In other words, Leah was going to give birth to another boy, but she understood, she realized that if she was going to have, she already had 6, that there was only going to be one left, so to speak. There were going to be 12 tribes. Rachel would only have 1. The Shvachot would each have 2. And Leah understood that her sister Rachel would have less than each of the Shvachot, and that wouldn't be right. So she davened for her that she should have one of the boys, that she should have two and at least have the same number of the Shvatim. And therefore, the babies were switched, so to speak. This is the Midrash. And then for it says that Rachel, instead of Rachel giving birth to a daughter, gave birth to a son, and Leah, instead of giving birth to a son, gave birth to a daughter. So Dinah and Yosef were essentially switched. That's the Midrash. Yes.
No, I always thought that Hashem made the girl into a boy, the boy into a girl.
So that's what I said. Right. So
not that they were switched,
So the Gemara in the Bavli has a slightly different version of this, which is more like along the lines of what you say. But this Midrash, that's how it says. This Midrash says that they were switched. In other words, Rachel was the one. So if we look at Dinah, if we look at the daughter, Rachel was the one who gave the genetic material, so to speak. She was the one the conception. But Leah was the one who gave birth. And we see at the end of the day, we say Dinah was born, and Dinah was but Leah. So who was the mother? The one who gave birth. So this is one of the first sources. When this question first came up, we're going back a few decades here, 40 years or so. But this technology comes to the world, and it's possible because for most of human history, this was a midrash, and this was just this couldn't happen. This is theoretical, right? We understand there are two functions of motherhood. It's the one who gives the genetic material and the one who gives birth to the baby. For most of human history, that was always the same woman. That was always the same mother. So there was never a question. Now, when technology exists, that makes it possible to separate those two functions. Which is the function that determines she's the mother. So based on this, there are many who said, okay, here we have the proof that Dinah is the daughter of Leah because she is the one who gave birth to her. Therefore, the birth mother would be considered the mother. And therefore, in our case, wherever the egg came from, wherever the genetic material would be irrelevant. Because ultimately, even if we know who it is, ultimately it's the woman who gave birth who would be the mother. Okay, that's one side of the argument. There's another way of looking at it, which is based on more of the psukim, but we're out of time, so maybe later in the week.